Imagine an empty street at dusk. The only sound is the wind whistling through the cracked timbers of abandoned houses. A child's toy, a simple wooden horse, lies on its side in the mud. There are no birds singing, no dogs barking. This is a world silenced by fear, a world where the living have begun to envy the dead. We think we know this story. We've seen the paintings of skeletal figures dancing with popes and kings. We've heard the staggering numbers. For centuries, the story has ended with the counting of the dead. The death toll is almost impossible to comprehend. Modern estimates suggest 30 to 50% of Europe's population was wiped out in less than 5 years. That's somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. Globally, the number could have been as high as 200 million. But that conventional history is incomplete. Most of us know the Black Death as the plague that killed millions. But the real story, the one buried under a mountain of statistics, isn't about the dead, it's about the survivors. What if I told you that the deadliest pandemic in history didn't just cause unimaginable horror, but also helped pave the way for a new world? A world of higher wages, greater freedom, and even accelerated the rise of the English language. This is the untold story of how the world was forever changed, not by those who died, but by those who were forced to live through the end of everything they had ever known. To understand the cataclysm, you first have to understand the world it broke. The Europe of the mid-14th century wasn't a tranquil, idyllic land of fairy tale castles. It was a world stretched to its breaking point. For nearly 3 centuries, Europe's population had exploded, doubling, maybe even tripling. This immense growth put an almost unbearable strain on the land and the rigid social structure that governed it. Feudalism. Life was defined by a strict hierarchy. At the top sat the king, who owned all the land. Beneath him were the nobles and barons. And at the bottom, the vast majority of the population were the peasants, or serfs. A serf wasn't a slave, but they certainly weren't free. They were tied to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission. They owed him labor, a portion of their crops, and unwavering obedience. It was a system built on obligation and an almost total lack of social mobility. You were born a peasant, and you would die a peasant. This teetering social pyramid was built on a foundation of agriculture, and that foundation was starting to crack. The continent had entered a little ice age, a period of cooler temperatures and wetter weather that made harvests unreliable. England, for instance, was devastated by the Great Famine of 1315 to 1320, a period of relentless rain and crop failure that killed 10 to 15% of its population. People were hungry, their immune systems compromised, and they were crowded into rapidly growing towns and cities that were filthy beyond our modern comprehension. Streets were open sewers. Homes were cramped, dark, and infested with rats, lice, and fleas. Into this stressed, hungry, and vulnerable world, a new kind of horror was about to be unleashed. The people of the 14th century had a profound personal relationship with God. The Catholic Church was the unquestioned authority on everything. It explained the universe, offered salvation, and provided the framework for life itself. When sickness came, it was often seen as a punishment for sin. But the sickness that was coming would not just test their faith, it would threaten to shatter it. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Their world was one of humors and miasma's bad air. They were a people standing on a precipice, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. The story of the Black Death's arrival in Europe begins on the trade routes of Central Asia, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis had long existed in rodent populations. Carried by fleas on the backs of black rats, it traveled west with the caravans of the Silk Road. Its first major European debut was at the Genoese trading post of Kaffa in the Crimea. In 1347, the city was under siege by the Mongol army of the Golden Horde. When the plague broke out among his soldiers, the Khan, Johnny Beg, made a decision that would alter history. In an act of early biological warfare, he ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers catapulted over the city walls. The Italian traders inside Kaffa watched in horror. The sickness spread like wildfire. Panicked, the Genoese merchants fled, boarding their galleys and setting sail for home. They didn't know it, but they were carrying the apocalypse with them. In their ships' holds, nestled in the cargo, were infected rats and their deadly fleas. In October of 1347, 12 of these galleys arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. The townspeople who gathered at the docks were met with a ghastly sight. Most of the sailors were either dead or dying, covered in strange black swellings that oozed blood and pus. Horrified, the Sicilian authorities ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The plague was ashore. From Sicily, it spread with terrifying speed. It was a foe unlike any they had ever faced, and it came in 3 horrific forms. The most common was the bubonic plague, transmitted by the bite of an infected flea. Victims would develop a fever, chills, and then the signature symptom, the buboes. These were agonizingly painful swellings of the lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. From the first bubo, a person had maybe a week to live. Even more terrifying was the pneumonic plague. This form infected the lungs and was spread through the air from person to person just by breathing. It was almost 100% fatal, with victims often dead within a day or two. Finally, there was the septicemic plague, when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. This was the rarest and deadliest form, killing its victims within hours. As the plague swept through Europe, people were bewildered, had no scientific understanding of what was happening. To them, it seemed like the wrath of God. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the horror in Florence, described the utter confusion. He noted that the symptoms were different from what they'd heard of in the East. Doctors, basing their knowledge on ancient texts, were powerless. Their remedies, bloodletting poultices, lancing the buboes, were useless. The pestilence moved faster than news, faster than rumor. It was an unstoppable, invisible tide of death about to drown a continent. As the plague tightened its grip, the very fabric of society unraveled. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. The world became a place of relentless, arbitrary death. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, pious or a sinner. This fear drove people to madness. The Florentine chronicler Marchione di Copo Stefani wrote of the desolation. Fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children. This was a scene repeated across Europe. The most basic bonds of human affection were severed by terror. People fled the cities for the countryside, hoping to outrun God's wrath, only to carry the disease with them. Boccaccio described how many, believing the end was nigh, gave themselves over to hedonism, to eat, drink, and be merry. Others ran to the opposite extreme, forming processions of flagellants who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with iron-tipped scourges as public penance. Their wanderings, however, only helped to spread the disease further. Law and order dissolved. With authorities dead or in hiding, criminals acted with impunity. Neighbors shunned neighbors. The sick were walled up in their homes to die. The sheer number of dead was overwhelming. Traditional funeral rites became a luxury. Mass graves were dug, great pits where corpses were piled up like lasagna, as one chronicler wrote, with layers of bodies separated by thin layers of earth. In Siena, a man named Agnolo di Tora wrote, and I, Agnolo di Tora, buried my 5 children with my own hands. So many died that all believed it was the end of the world. In this chaos, a desperate search for a scapegoat began. The most convenient target was one that had been persecuted for centuries. The Jews. A terrible rumor spread that the Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells. This conspiracy theory ignited a firestorm of violence. Despite Pope Clement VI issuing 2 papal bulls declaring their innocence, the madness was unstoppable. Across Europe, Jewish communities were annihilated. In Strasbourg in 1349, even before the plague had reached the city, 900 Jews were rounded up and burned alive in their own cemetery. Perhaps no story better captures the combination of horror and heroism of this IRA, even though it comes from a later outbreak than that of IM, a small English village. In 1665, during the Great Plague, the pestilence arrived in a bale of cloth from London. As villagers began to die, the local rector convinced them to make an unthinkable choice, to quarantine themselves completely to prevent the plague from reaching surrounding towns. For 14 months, the village was sealed off. Food was left at boundary stones, paid for with coins soaked in vinegar, which they hoped would act as a disinfectant. Inside, the suffering was immense. One woman, Elizabeth Hancock, buried her husband and all 6 of her children over just 8 days. By the time it was over, more than 260 of the roughly 350 villagers were dead. It was an act of almost unimaginable self-sacrifice, a small point of light in an ocean of darkness, illustrating the terrible choices people faced in a world that had come undone. The sheer psychological horror of this period is difficult to comprehend. It was a trauma seared into the collective memory of Europe for generations. These stories of individual suffering, social collapse, and desperate acts of cruelty and courage are a vital part of history. If you find this exploration of the human side of the past compelling, consider subscribing to our community. We believe that understanding these personal stories is the key to truly understanding history. Now, let's explore what happened when the dying finally stopped. The plague burned through Europe for nearly 5 years. When the fires finally died down around 1351, the survivors stepped into a changed world. It was quieter and haunted by ghosts, but it was also a world of shocking, unprecedented opportunity. The untold story of the Black Death isn't just about the horror. It's about the revolutionary changes that rose from its ashes, changes that would ultimately bring the Middle Ages to a violent end. The most immediate change was economic. For centuries, the feudal economy had been based on a massive surplus of labor and a scarcity of land. The plague flipped that equation on its head. Suddenly, labor was the scarce commodity. With up to half the population gone, there was an acute shortage of workers. For the first time, surviving peasants had leverage. Lords of manors, desperate for workers, were forced to compete for them. This led to something unthinkable just a decade earlier. Wages began to rise dramatically. Serfs could now demand payment, and if one lord refused, they could leave and find another who would pay. The bonds of feudalism began to fray, and in many parts of Western Europe, dissolve. Landowners tried to fight back. The English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it was useless. The economic reality was too powerful. Land was now plentiful and cheap. Peasants who had once been little more than property could now lease their own farms and enjoy a higher standard of living. However, this decline of serfdom wasn't universal. In Eastern Europe, by contrast, laws were tightened, tying the remaining peasantry more tightly to the land than ever before. This economic revolution was matched by a revolution in thought. The Church, which had claimed to be the sole intermediary with God, had been powerless. Its prayers went unanswered, and its clergy died just as horribly as everyone else. This failure led to a widespread crisis of faith. People began to question the Church's authority, which helped create the intellectual space for the questioning spirit of the Renaissance, and eventually, the Protestant Reformation. The plague didn't cause these movements, but it was undeniably a violent catalyst. The cultural landscape was also transformed. A new, morbid obsession with death appeared in art, captured in the motif of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, a stark reminder that death was the great equalizer. Yet alongside this darkness, there was a new celebration of life. This new humanism, a focus on individual experience and earthly life, was a core engine of the Italian Renaissance. In England, the deaths among the French and Latin-speaking clergy and aristocracy accelerated the rise of vernacular English as the language of government and literature, clearing a path for writers like Geoffrey Chaucer. The world after the plague was a different world, forged in suffering but pregnant with new possibilities. The Black Death wasn't just a 14th century event. Shockwaves rippled through the centuries, and its legacy is part of our world in ways we often don't recognize. The survivors didn't just rebuild their old world, they were forced to invent a new one. One of the most enduring legacies was the birth of public health. It was the port city of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast that first instituted a mandatory 30-day isolation period for arriving ships in 1377. This was later extended to 40 days, or quarantino, from which we get our modern word quarantine. This idea, isolating the potentially sick to protect the healthy, was a radical innovation born directly from the trauma of the plague. Medical knowledge was also profoundly altered. The utter failure of traditional medicine forced a painful reassessment. This humbling experience slowly opened the door to a new kind of medicine, one based less on ancient authority and more on direct observation, the foundation of modern science. The economic shifts were equally permanent. The collapse of serfdom in Western Europe was accelerated to a point of no return, creating a more modern, dynamic workforce. Some historians even argue this new, high-wage economy incentivized the development of labor-saving technologies. It's helping to set Europe on a unique path of innovation. And fascinatingly, recent studies suggest the plague's legacy might even be written in our DNA. Scientists are exploring the theory that surviving the Black Death may have driven evolutionary changes in the human immune system, selecting for genes that offered better protection against Yersinia pestis. While these adaptations may have helped our ancestors, they may also be linked to our susceptibility to certain autoimmune diseases today, though this remains an active area of research. But perhaps the most profound legacy is psychological. The Black Death showed that the institutions people trusted, government, church, medicine, could collapse. It revealed how quickly fear can turn neighbors into monsters. But it also showed the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The survivors endured a trauma that is almost beyond our imagining. They lost families, friends, and entire communities. And yet they carried on. They rebuilt. They adapted. They fought for better lives, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for the modern world. When we face our own modern crises, we are grappling with the same questions of fear, responsibility, and how to rebuild in the aftermath of catastrophe. The untold story of the Black Death is not just a history of death, it's a testament to the enduring, transformative power of survival. The story of the Black Death is so often told through the lens of its terrifying mortality. The numbers are so large, the horror so absolute that it's easy to miss the human drama at its heart. But when we shift our focus from the dead to the survivors, the narrative changes. It stops being a story about an ending and becomes a story about a beginning. Violent, traumatic, and profoundly transformative beginning. The survivors walked out of a nightmare and into a world where the old certainties were gone. Psychological scars they carried were immense, yet from that trauma, they forged a new society. They challenged authority, demanded their own worth, and laid the foundations for systems that would lead to the Renaissance and the modern age. Their story is a powerful reminder that history's greatest turning points aren't just abstract events, but the collective result of individual human experiences of loss, fear, and ultimately, of the will to endure and rebuild. The world we live in today was, in many ways, shaped by their suffering and their resilience. And that is the true untold story of the Black Death.